This presentation covers Era 2, from 1920 to 1950, and the formalization of the field of marketing. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, during this time, if you remember from Era 1, marketing was really just getting started. It was a fledgling discipline. Not many individuals were teachers of what we know today as marketing. So this era really formalizes what students should know about marketing, so who the future marketers will be. And from this, we get a better understanding of how we got to where we are today for what we teach you in marketing classes. So at this time, between 1920 and 1950, there were several different approaches to teaching marketing to students. One being the commodity approach, two, the institutional approach, and then three, the functional approach, which we will be most familiar with. And we're going to go through each of these. So the commodity approach is where a individual or a teacher would help students understand marketing by classifying different types of products and identifying the different processes that it takes to distribute them. So there's the manufacturing of particular products, and here we have food products. All of these requires different types of production, and all of these also require different types of distribution. Obviously, we have some that need to be refrigerated, others that can be stored on the shelf for longer periods of time, and so the commodity approach was a way to classify different products. What orientation is this most associated with in your textbook? This is found on page 4. This approach is most associated with the product orientation, which covers the company's focus on products alone, which we know not to be the case if we're following a marketing orientation. And we're going to cover that later in Era 3. So commodity approach is most associated with the product orientation. Next, we have the institutional approach, where students would be taught marketing by being able to identify the different types of wholesalers and retailers and what their role was in distribution. Because if you remember, marketing at this time was synonymous with distribution. However, we've discussed how distribution and marketing differ, which distribution is just one of the many activities that marketing does, which comes under the functional approach. So back in 1917, the functional approach to marketing was being defined. So these are the services that have to be performed in getting the commodity or the product or service from the producer to the consumer. And there are different marketing academics that listed and discussed different marketing functions. Obviously, we've talked about exchange being one of the core marketing functions. That's the buying and selling. We also have to have transportation and storage, which is the distribution aspect. And then there's other functions which are auxiliary to this, which are financing, standardizing, and grading, and market information. Grading is really important, especially during that time, because quality was such an issue in the early 1900s with meat packing, and this is where standardizing and grading of these products really became a prominent focus and something that fell underneath the realm of marketing. So all of these things are really important and things that we have come to understand as marketing today. So this is getting us towards what we know as marketing. Now, one of the key things during this time is that marketing was solidified. Their role as a strategic business unit is born. And the key thing to understand here is it's born, but it was ignored during this time. So to give you a little bit of a timeline on this, manufacturing brands became well established. So brands that we know of today, like Procter & Gamble, those brands became very well established during that time. However, there became a huge battle of brands during this time, and not only were the individuals and government officials really having a distaste of marketing and distribution. Um, there were other things going on at this time also. So with the distaste of marketing and distribution, they thought, okay, marketing and what we thought of at that time as marketing, which would be distribution, it cost too much because there were middlemen involved, and when middlemen were involved, that raised the cost. The middlemen being the wholesalers that took the goods from the manufacturer and got them to the retailer. So during this time, even government officials really disliked the idea of marketing and distribution. So what happened was is there was a decline of manufacturer brands, and there was a major increase of retail brands. What we know of as what we've talked about in Era 1, which is the brands that we know like from Walmart Great Value or Sam's, Members Mark. And the reason for this is that retailers, individual retailers, had a huge advantage of having power over the supply chain, and they were super efficient. The supermarket here, A&P, actually had 18,000 locations in the early 1930s. So they had a huge hold over the manufacturers who were giving them products to sell in their store, because without A&P, those manufacturers weren't going to be able to get their product to the consumers. So it was really important at this time. These retailers had a really strong hold against these manufacturers, and so they could come up with their retail brands, and they were the winners. However, after World War II, manufacturer brands take hold again, and that's where we are today. We see that manufacturer brands are very prominent. We don't see a lot of retailer brands, and those retailer brands now are basically what we know of as being the more inexpensive option for us at a store or retail location. So that brings us to a little bit more of talking about the role in the strategic business unit. Now, at this time, there were a lot of functional managers present, and I had mentioned this in the Era 1 video. But what do I mean by functional managers in marketing and agencies? Well, the key idea here is that there were production managers, research and development managers, sales managers, advertising. All of these were in different functional areas within the organization. They weren't underneath one umbrella within the firm. So it was really difficult for a firm to really be organized whenever they were selling a particular product, because it was all split up across the organization. There is no consistency or organization, and that makes really what I just mentioned no real way for them to coordinate their strategies for similar brands or similar products. And so what happened is, in the 1930s to 1950 time frame, there were companies that decided to implement what we call today as the functional or managerial approach to brand management. And so what happens is, a manager, marketing manager or brand manager, is over a single brand or a portfolio of brands. So what I included here is P&G, Procter & Gamble, what we're probably most familiar with. They were the originators of this idea, and they have a ton of individual brands underneath their Procter & Gamble family brand. So here we have like Olay, and they have skincare products and deodorant. So underneath that one brand, they would have a manager that managed all of those skincare type products. And that became very efficient, because if we think about skincare or toothpaste, those would need to be marketed in very different ways. So having a marketing manager that focuses on controlling the advertising, the sales, the research and development, and the production makes things a lot more efficient. So Uh, Post 1950, they focused on B2B rather than B2C, but pre 1950, there were a lot of companies that were working on the business to consumer side. So this is why I say that it was born, but in many companies it was ignored because there weren't a lot of companies that took hold of this until after Era 2 and Era 3. Now we are moving closer towards the marketing concept. In 1927, White published a book called Scientific Marketing Management. And this is one of the first textbooks that focused on more of a scientific managerial approach to teaching marketing. And in this textbook, they focus on how firms should be consumer needs oriented. They should focus on the needs and wants of the consumer. You find out what the consumer wants, and then you give it to him. And this aligns with chapter 1 in a very specific way, and that is selecting a target market. Whenever you select a target market, which we'll talk about in the segmentation strategy chapter, whenever you select a target market, you're focusing on selecting a market that you're satisfying a need or want for that target market. If that target market doesn't even want your product, there's no even real reason to target that particular market. So we're starting to get towards that marketing concept. The next idea is that we start thinking about marketing as competition oriented. Just like strategy has a main focus of competition, marketing was also focusing on competition here. So we've talked about how strategy assumes a theory of how competition works, and competition is really central to strategy. During this time, segmentation and the segment was already being brought into how firms can compete. And then finally, whenever we talk about competition, there's this supply and demand approach to competition that's common in economics. It's really been the main thing in economics for at least 100 years. And so what happened here is that we began to think of competition not in equilibrium, but more of a struggle between firms. So think of this as like the survival of the fittest. When we have competition, just like I've talked about in sports, you're trying to get to be number one, the best. And winning that gold medal or being first is really the key thing for competition. So also, there were things that we could talk about is that there's qualitative changes in demand rather than quantitative changes in supply. So talking about this, we focus on consumers' tastes, their preferences, their values, and how those can change. So this would be the difference between an external focus versus an internal focus that we talk about in the first chapter on page 10. And then finally, firms can adapt to their environment. I'll let you look up how this aligns with the text on page 6 and 16, but the key thing here is that as the environment is always changing, firms have the ability to adapt, and they have to adapt. Otherwise, they'll get left behind, right? If firms do not adapt to the environment and the changing situation, they will not last. Many firms have tried to go against the grain, and they fail. So the other thing here is that with Alderson's view of competition, the market can be divided into different segments. We talked about that in segmentation, but marketing really brought into this idea that markets can be divided, and that means that companies can then personalize their products or services to a particular target market. Finally, we talk about the specialization of suppliers. So previously, suppliers would focus on big conglomerates and try to be all things to all people. But now they would be much more specific on what types of products they were going to provide, the times that they were going to provide them, and particular places that they could provide them as well. So that covers all of Era 2. Next, we will cover Era 3. And if you have any questions on Era 2, please feel free to email me at kt.manus@ttu.edu. Thanks.